Comes into the final corner. Collins throws it down the inside. A block pass goes through, and he slows down Tremblay enough that Cassis will race to the line as Van Winkle goes off in the background. Torn Collins wins in a breathless super sport race. Young makes the move on the inside, picks up the drive towards the line, and it is too close to go up, though it looks like Garan has come away victorious. What a finish!
Welcome to the Canadian Superbike Podcast.
You've seen some crazy stuff in turn 8 off the back straight there, particularly between Young and Garan, and Jordan is going to have to measure up to that standard.
Tips it in, and Dumas is down. They will have to clean up that oil spill, but it comes too late for Alex Dumas. Zook doesn't look like he has enough, Colin, and Ben Young's going to bring it home for the title. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Canadian Superbike Podcast. For the first time in 2026, 3 squares in the Hollywood Squares right here, as we are extremely thankful to have been given a little bit of time by Steve English at Racing Lowdown is where you can find him on the IG. If you are on there, if you prefer to go to other social platforms, follow at Paddock Podcast, of course, and that's where Steve does a bunch of his work. But he is a World Superbike commentator and does a ton of work in and around MotoGP as well. Journalist, reporter, all of that good stuff, which we're extremely thankful to have you on, Steve. But my first question is there anything more rattling to you than the disparity of energy from David Emmett, otherwise known as Moto Matters, between the end of 22 rounds of MotoGP and having a little bit of time to himself throughout the winter and then going to a test? Because I swear that guy was born again going into the test recently at MotoGP. The enthusiasm through the microphone on Paddock Pass was incredible.
Yeah, he was ready for it. He was definitely ready to get himself out to Sepang. But it's one of those things that for everyone working, especially in MotoGP is full on now with 22 rounds, 22 sprints. The whole weekend is different to even 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And everyone was feeling it at the end of that season. So I would be quite sympathetic towards Dave for that. That's the good thing about World Superbikes. We have 12 rounds a year, and even for me last year going over to do 5 rounds in MotoAmerica, to do the TT as well, you know, I do 18, 19 rounds a year, but at least it's spread out quite well, whereas in MotoGP it's very condensed and very intense, so it's easy for it to get a bit overwhelming at the end, particularly whenever at the end of the day the racing wasn't particularly good last year and the championship battle was over effectively before it started. By the time we went to Mugello, I think everyone knew exactly what was going to happen for the rest of the year. So I think everyone was a little bit ready for that season to end. And now everyone's ready for a new one to begin because you just never know how it's all going to play out.
Yeah, definitely. We'll get to a little bit maybe on MotoAmerica and the Daytona 200, which we are going to coming up in about a month's time. We'll dabble into a little bit of World Superbike stuff here in a second. But just on the front end, I know something that has been interesting, Colin, that he's been kind of picking apart and reading some different articles and all the rest of the reports on. Just how much trouble is Yamaha in with their MotoGP V4 project, do you think, right now? Because it was kind of one of those things at the test in Sepang where it was kind of the optics seemed horrific and everybody was like, this is the story of the test. And then the other side of it was people going, well, other people weren't out on the track and it was just the start and they're just trying to figure it out this year. And so how should we actually look at the Yamaha issues that came out of that test?
Personally, I think we should look at it with absolutely no level of expectation for Yamaha at all, because if they had kept running last year's bike, they'd be nowhere. So they have to make a change. They've gone to the V4. They've tried something totally different. And it's only for 1 year. So it's either going to work really well or it's not going to work really well. And then they're onto a new bike anyway. So this is a proper learning year. If they're able to get some good results at some stage, fair play to them. If they're at the back of the field, is anyone going to notice a big difference compared to last year? Not really. So I think it's one of those ones where, you know, you want to obviously see any manufacturer that puts in that level of investment, that they're able to make the steps, get themselves to the front. But it's also unlikely considering they've got so much ground to make up, so much learning to do. So I think this is all something that just plays into 2027, the new regs, and then that's really where we get to see where they're at. But I think it's one of those things as well, like I'm a software engineer by trade, and when you see such a massive development taking place, you have to also take your hat off to them because they're brave enough to do it. They didn't have to spend all that money. They could have just immediately focused on 2027, basically just roll out a test bike every day of the year in Japan for the next 12 months. And instead, they've actually tried to do this. So hopefully it works for them.
Colin, what do you got?
Well, it's an interesting discussion because it's kind of like you come home late and your parents are mad at you, and then on top of that they tell you should clean up your room. So we're hearing stuff like they don't have enough starters for the V4 configuration, that it's a different external starter, and it's like all of this kind of ugly gossipy kind of stuff is coming out, which makes you think that there's some people speaking who probably have a contract that suggests they're not supposed to be sharing that kind of information. And, if Quartararo wants a reason to bail out, it looks like he's got all kinds of them. And of course, he started talking again, and it isn't very positive.
Yeah, I mean, the way that has played out publicly as they've been coming out of that test certainly seems to scream that there's people that have kind of got their emotions perhaps more in tow than originally expected in the way that it's gone. But let's move on to World Superbike here, Stephen. Talk about the transition, I guess, between the two, which is the rider making the transition between the two. As part of that conversation around Yamaha, we understand that Toprak is going to end up having himself a year of trying to learn and develop and all that. But why every time that I see a Toprak quote do I feel like it's this incredible mixture of raw honesty with he's somehow playing a game that he's trying to angle for something that it's almost like he knows how it's going to be perceived down the road, and so it's like he's been instructed maybe by Keenan or somebody else in the background of like, hey, here's the way that we want to present this, but then he's also just wholesome, and so he just tries to talk honestly. There's like this weird fight going on as he makes the shift into MotoGP from World Superbike.
Yeah, Toprak's a really interesting rider because there's some riders whenever you're talking to them and you just know that they're lying to you and you're just kind of like, okay, fair enough. I'll just nod my head, I'll agree with you, and then I'll just not listen to anything that you've really said to me. Whereas Toprak, I've known him for 10 years, and as far as I can tell, he's never told a lie to me. He's very rarely, well, he's never told a lie as far as I can tell to any of the other journalists. He doesn't try and paint a picture that isn't there. He tries to just be himself. And the big reason for that is he saw that everybody loves him whenever he's himself. He comes to any Superbike race for the last 5 years and there was just, everyone was there to see him. They wanted to see him on his Paddock scooter. They wanted to see him just being himself. And I think he was able to see that you don't have to portray yourself in a certain way as long as you're genuine. And he's been able to see that. And I don't think that there's anything with him where there's a side where he's trying to be a bit smart or to play a long game. If he says something, it's definitely what he thinks it's going to be. And I think that it's probably not going to fare too well for him this year because people are going to be thinking back to, well, you're the guy that won those Superbike championships. You've gone to MotoGP. Why are you not getting out of Q1? Why is this happening? Why is that happening? And I think he's going to then have to look at it and say, oh, there's reasons for it. And that could be, the reason that he's struggling could be the reason why he thought, 6 months ago, whenever he said how excited he was to go to MotoGP, they could be the same reason. And that's one of those things that some riders are really clever with it. You look at how Rossi was able to manipulate the media for decades, and other riders, they don't have that to them. So I think for me with Toprak, a lot of it's just going to come down to how he is in 2027, because he can easily be the best Superbike rider that's ever lived. And for my money, on the basis of my 10 years working in Superbikes and what he's been able to do compared to everyone else, he is the best Superbike rider there's ever been. May not be statistically or this, that, or the other, but like when you look at what he can do in a bike, that doesn't necessarily translate to MotoGP. He might be a bad MotoGP rider. And I remember whenever he signed with Yamaha, one of the first things he said to me was, even if this doesn't go well, I'll come back to Superbikes in 2 years. Everyone's going to want me to be on their bike. So he understands that it could go badly in MotoGP, but he also knows that you have to go and take that chance whenever the opportunity's there.
With him making that switch, obviously Nicola Bulliga's got the contract with Ducati going forward, and we expect that he's going to get some form of shot 27, 28, whether it comes out of the testing stuff in 26 or he runs away with the championship in 2026 here in World Superbike. But who gets to play, I guess, the rival, the villain? Who's going to step up and bring the battle to Bulliga, in your opinion, in 2026? Because I just playing this out in my mind after watching the last couple of years where him and Toprak fed off of each other. It almost reminds me of the scene in The Dark Knight where like the Joker's laying down and he's basically screaming at Batman, come on, I want you to do it. I want you to do it. It's like they needed each other, right? It was this battle, and without having the other, the Joker's not going to be as evil because Batman's not going to be the one that's holding them accountable. And there's this great tension between the two. If you take the Joker out of The Dark Knight, that movie sucks. Like, what happens, right? So I'm just kind of trying to figure out, okay, who is going to be the one to drag the best out of Bulliga, or is there going to be this moment by the midway point of this World Superbike season where Bulliga's kind of like out in front on points and looking around and going, damn, I kind of miss Toprak. Like, I miss the chaos of that. I miss the fact that we would just like drag the best out of each other.
Yeah, riders always want to be pushed. But Colin, all your years around paddocks, how many times have you gone into a season and you've thought, there's no way that this rider can be beaten. He's going to win every race. He's going to do this. He's going to do that. And it just doesn't work out that way. It can be a crash at round one, takes away his confidence, an injury, mechanical, whatever it is. You know, it only takes one moment and that momentum's gone. Now, Bulliga should win. He should dominate. He should be the champion by the end of the year. He should be in MotoGP in 27 just because of the Pirelli change and the fact that that'll give him a bit of a benefit. But it may not play out that way because there's been so many times it's played out differently. Look at even a good example of it would be Foggy's last year, 2000. He has a massive crash in Phillip Island. His career's ended and Ducati had to go to AMA Superbikes to find Troy Bayliss to get him to come over to the World Championship. Like, Colin, how many times have you seen it where just what you expect to play out just doesn't play out?
Well, it's you're hoping for some kind of surprise, and of course the Stoner ascendance was partly a Bridgestone thing, but nonetheless at the time that was a bit of a surprise. You had to be a real Paddock insider, I think, to have seen that coming. I also think it's interesting that a year ago, because Phillip Island didn't go that well for Razgat Lioglu, that he was talking about the Ducati Cup, right? And his comeback was because fans from a distance expected it. His comeback probably didn't get the attention and respect it deserved. It was an incredible achievement, and I can't help but wonder. I would not want to be one of the two new factory BMW riders because for the longest time, BMW were not a consistent factor. And, I was around in that paddock with a Canadian guy who raced in the series briefly, McCormick, the year that BMW almost won the championship. And they were way ahead of themselves that they thought that was going to happen. And it took a lot longer than they expected. And, I don't mean to be critical of Yamaha, but are BMW going to fade back into the midfield of World Superbike, right? There's a lot of interesting questions, and hopefully, like, it'd be great if somebody from a Yamaha started performing consistently and changed, the pressure points at the front, right? That would be what the series could really use, or heaven forbid, Honda start performing consistently.
Yeah, I think it's one of those ones where ultimately it's a riders' championship. Riders make the difference, and BMW showed that with Toprak as well. Because think of all the millions that BMW spent over the course of the development of the M1000 or the S1000, the team, the infrastructure, everything like that. And it took spending 2 million a year on Toprak, 3 million a year on Toprak to deliver a championship. So is Petrucci that guy? On the basis of what we've seen, no, because Danilo is a very good rider, but he's in that second tier of riders. He can win races, but he needs everything to go his way. He had a Ducati for 3 years. He won 3 races. So you can't expect that he's going to jump on to the BMW, which in Toprak's hand could win races, could win championships. In no one else's hands it could. So I think that's going to be tough for him. Oliveira comes in as a rookie, and he comes in as a rookie that never wanted to go to World Superbikes. Think back to his comments for 5-6 years. He only talked about MotoGP. He was asked about Superbikes, never wanted to go to it. Now he has to basically grow into that and try and salvage something for the next couple of years for BMW. Oliveira is a great rider, probably a more talented rider than Petrucci, a more rounded rider than Petrucci on a Superbike. I think in time that'll be the case, but he's got a lot of learning to do. So I don't expect much for BMW right now. If they don't have the two riders that can do it, Yamaha don't have the riders that can do it either, because Andrea Locatelli has basically been their team leader for the last couple of years when Jonathan Rea was struggling so much with the bike. No one's really thinking, I want to pay Locatelli $1 million a year to be our number one rider as a manufacturer. For Remy Gardner, he's been inconsistent. He's had injuries as well. Javi Vierge moves from Honda. Manzi moves up from Supersport. I don't see any of them right now being a guy that in a year's time we're thinking they've made that big step forward to be a real contender. So Yamaha, probably just because the bike isn't quite there, the rider lineup isn't quite there, you can't really expect them to make too big of a step. So in actual fact, you're really looking to see, can one of the independent Ducatis step up? Because Bautista goes to Barney, and that's a big upgrade for Barney because they've got a double world champion, a guy that's won so many races, and that's a step from where they have with Petrucci. So maybe they can make a bit of progress, and the new Ducati, it might just suit Bautista, and he's able to do a little bit more with it. Last year, we saw Sam Lowe's made a big step forward, so he's a rider that will be fast enough to be able to, at least in a Superpole session, Superpole races, go with Bulica. But ultimately, Bulica has that edge until someone takes it away from him. And as we move into the start of the season, it's very difficult to see who that person is. But someone will always step up, and someone will always be the next nearest challenger. And then we just have to see how much progress they can make through the season.
So Jake Dixon.
What about? Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that's my takeaway. So Jake Dixon, that's what Steve said, right? That's what you heard, Colin? Yeah.
You can hear what you want to hear on it, Mark.
My question though is, can it? If a satellite Ducati is doing well enough, can they get the engines they need to be in context with the A Ducatis?
The biggest thing isn't mechanically, it's the personnel. I think that one of the big things we saw last year was electronics is obviously what makes everything go around with a superbike now, but fuel flow control is probably the biggest thing as well. And I thought there was a lot of races last year where you saw that the independent Ducatis were pretty close to the factory bikes, and then they'd get onto a long straight and suddenly they'd disappear ever so slightly. And a lot of that was actually just the fuel flow rather than suddenly the Aruba bikes having an extra 15 horsepower because of an engine upgrade. The rules in superbikes are effectively, if you're able to run it, you have to sell it. So the only thing that you can't sell is personnel. So you're able to rent out your engineers, you're able to withhold quite a bit as well from the independent teams until they start either spending the money or performing better. So I think that for me, the biggest thing that we'll probably see right from the start of the season in Phillip Island is, have any of those independent teams made the step in terms of being able to jump out of a corner and go with Bulica? Because I think if you're able to even come out of the last corner in Phillip Island and stick with them, at least that's a sign that you're making progress, even with that last corner being so fast. The exit of Miller corner as well, you'll see something in that as well for how you're able to pick up the gas and get out of that corner. So I think there's a few things that will be telltale signs that it's a little bit more equal between the independents and the factory teams. But a lot of that is, at the end of the day, just thinking aloud right now, because we haven't had dry weather running during the course of the winter. So only with a few hours running, you're kind of just piecing together all the pieces of a puzzle without really being able to see what's on the box to be able to know what you're looking at.
I guess the question now becomes...
And what about this Pirelli issue with a shortage of alleged tires for testing?
There's always something that's going to Phillip Island. And we've obviously had the pit stop races in recent years. I dislike the pit stop races. I would prefer if we ended up, instead of it being, I don't know what it is, a 21 lap race, instead of it being a 21 lap race with 11 and 10 lap stints, I'd prefer if we just had a 16 lap race or a 15 lap race. And it's up to you just to use what you've got. And that's ultimately what we want to see whenever we're racing. I don't like to see it where races come down to who's able to be as close to the minimum time you're supposed to spend in pit lane to be able to win a race. I want to see it where it's all settled on the track. So hopefully we don't have the pit stops this year. The shortage of tires getting there is just unfortunate. They're shipped over and you can just have a delay. If you remember a few years ago, there was a problem with the Suez Canal. There's obviously been problems in the Panama Canal at times as well, getting stuff out through any of those shipping lanes. Once there's a backlog, it then just impacts everything that's sent through there. So this was just unfortunate for Pirelli, but given what we've seen in recent years, they really could have done without the negative publicity going into Phillip Island.
Yeah, I could have done without the negative publicity, but it also worries me because one of the things that Colin and I have talked about is our wish to see World Superbike go to more places around the globe. And if you're the one that you're going away to is having logistics issues and headaches, then that doesn't necessarily suggest that it's going to push them forward to be open to making that change, because things are more difficult the further you go. That's how things work, right? But yeah, go ahead.
Well, let's this is a good time to ask that question. What do you think of World Superbike when it doesn't go to the United States, which is, they're about to celebrate their 50th anniversary of the birth of Superbike racing. That's happening at Daytona, and they don't go to Japan, where a lot of the motorcycles are made. And a cynic would argue that's not much of a World Superbike series. And I guess the problem is that they couldn't ever really land a place that felt like home.
It's a strange one because we've gone to a lot of places that ended their contracts early as well. We went to Indonesia. That was supposed to be a 10-year contract. Once MotoGP came, they just wanted to be a MotoGP circuit, which is fair enough. Buriram was the same. We went there for 5 years, and the whole purpose was to build that up to be a MotoGP venue, and that worked successfully. We went to Argentina, and we were in San Juan for, I think, 2 years, maybe 3 years. And then there's a change in government, and they didn't want to spend the money on having superbikes despite having a contract. So you take away those tracks, and suddenly it changes quite a bit. America's always been a strange one because you look at Laguna, and how many times has there been problems with funding in Laguna, changes of ownership, and there's never really been stability at that track. And that has obviously had an impact on what events they're able to get. I'd love to go back to Laguna. That was always one of my favorite events because we were paired up with MotoAmerica. So in terms of organizing things out, it was a lot easier because it was shared across the load. And I think that for me, ideally, I'd love to see us go back to something like that, even if it's only the Superbike class, like it used to be going to that round. I'd love, obviously, everyone wants to see us go back to Suzuka, go back to Japan. I'd love to see it where we go to Suzuka because I've been there for the 8 hours and it's such a great track. It's such a great event that would be ideal. But, we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a world where someone has to pay for it. And finding someone to foot that bill is always tricky. And you look at how difficult it is for any championship to find circuits. And I think that that's probably one of the factors that's worked against World Superbikes. But one of the things that works in its favor is that for the 12 rounds that we do have, typically over the course of the last few years, the racing's been good, interest level has gone up, and you're kind of hoping that we're able to now come out of COVID and all those things. Because even though it's 3 or 4 years ago, it's impacted us a lot more than it impacted other championships. It impacted Formula One to quite a small degree. They actually ended up growing because of Drive to Survive or whatever else. So F1 grew at an exponential rate, and that ended up really punishing a lot of other championships because they just weren't able to get the eyeballs anymore. So I think that for World Superbikes, because we're smaller than MotoGP and we don't have the resources, GP took those resources and they've been able to continue to grow. Whereas for Superbikes now, we're at a point where we do need to have that little bit of input and that bit more support. And at the end of the day, support is financial. If you're able to raise more money, you're able to go to more places, you're able to have more events. And I think that what I'd like to see is just one more flyway race. After we go to Phillip Island, can you go back via Bahrain or Sepang or Japan and be able to run a race there? It's step by step, but I'm sure that you had it as well, Colin, whenever you were looking at your time at the Canadian Championship. Everyone outside of the person that has to make the decision has all the ideas, but they don't have any of the responsibilities. And I think that it's one of those situations that for World Superbikes, I think Greg Livia does a really good job because the manufacturers respect him and the job that he does. But to try and grow it, he wants to grow it. Everyone wants to grow it. It's just to try and do it where it's responsible, because otherwise you end up in a situation where you can run out of money very quickly and a championship disappears. And that's the last thing anyone wants.
So from a subjective point of view, it's interesting that when, last summer, all the discussions about Razgat Lioglu and him going to MotoGP, and I think a lot of the MotoGP riders were kind of comfortable criticizing him from a distance, which a lot of the fans took as a criticism of the whole paddock in World Superbike, which is unfair and unfortunate. But it was interesting. I was at Valencia because I also work with our mini series, which finishes in Valencia. And when he was there, which was his first official appearance as a MotoGP rider, he actually got a fair bit of respect from those guys. He seemed to be making an effort to fit in and get along, but nonetheless, they, whatever snarky things they had to say, they weren't saying it when he was there, which I found a surprise, honestly.
Yeah, well, it's like anything else. It's always a lot harder to be nasty to someone to their face, particularly when they're being nice to you. So, you don't really say too many bad things in that sort of situation. I think that for me, one of the things that we've seen is riders have always respected Toprak, and they've always looked at it that someone like Marc Marquez is obviously the best rider we've ever seen, and for me, there's no question about that. He does things on a bike that no one else can do. Toprak does things on a bike that no one else can do. Mark can do it on a GP bike. We'll wait and see if Toprak can. I think riders are able to spot that and respect it. I think there was a lot of team personnel that were not able to do that, and there was an awful lot more in the media that weren't willing to do that because they just don't watch Superbike racing. And like I know for at the end of the day, you look at any of the domestic Superbike championships, how many people in World Superbikes are actually sitting down to watch everything that's happening in MotoAmerica or the IDM or the Canadian Championship or BSB, and there's not that many of them. So if that's the case in the Superbike infrastructure, you can imagine what it's like in GP whenever you go back to what we were talking about at the top of the show, 22 races, 22 sprints, all the testing, the build up, the whole season is just geared towards only GP. Otherwise, you just can't perform. So not that many people would have watched Toprak, and ultimately they missed out. They might have seen him once a year and they think, oh, yeah, that's pretty cool. Or the other side of it is all they saw was, oh, not another stoppie in pit lane. And they just get fed up of it. Whereas they don't actually see all the things that he does to integrate within a team, to make a team work around him, to make sure that there's a good atmosphere within a team. And it's those things that make a champion. And I think that that's where, over the course of this year, I think people will be surprised by what he's able to do because Yamaha will buy into him and the team will buy into him. And he's got a good comparison. He's up against Jack Miller. So Miller is another one of those riders, like what I was saying earlier on. He's a tier two rider. He's one of those guys that on his day can win a race. On his other days, he can have a crash, he can have this, he can have that. He's not going to be a MotoGP world champion, but we know what his level is. And if Toprak's able to get close to that, that reflects well for Razgatlioglu. If he's able to outperform Alex Rins, which in fairness he should do just because of Rins' injury issues, then he's at least able to have hit that one target. And then you look at Miller and then you look at Fabio Quartararo, and there's no expectation that he's going out there within Yamaha to beat Fabio because that's an unrealistic target for him. But to be able to beat Rins is a very realistic goal. To be able to match Miller as early as he can, that's another realistic target for him. Because ultimately in racing, if you're not able to beat those riders, you don't deserve to be on the grid. And everyone gets found out one way or the other. You're either found out to be a superstar or you're found out to be not good enough. And Toprak's going to face that challenge the same way that 1,000 riders have had to face that challenge in 500s or MotoGP.
So three years ago, when Petrucci came over to the MotoAmerica paddock, and his first race coincidentally was at Coda, and he had just come off the Dakar, and he was in a paddock which had all of his friends there, right? Because the MotoGP teams were all there, and Ducati had gone to great lengths to bring a bike for him because the production run of super bikes for regular people hadn't worked through. And obviously he was the center of attention from the American local press, if you will. And one of the things he talked about is in MotoGP, if you can find 0.3 of a second over a day, then you're having a good day. And he told this story at a conference about talking to Rossi, and they're both really dejected because they've been having a run of bad races, and how this looking for the 0.3 has you, lying in your motorhome staring at the ceiling, not being able to sleep. Well, now he's, injected himself back into the world of 0.3, right? Like he's in that situation now, right? And he's not, so far, what I've seen of him, not a fast starter, sometimes a little careful early in the going. And Razgatlioglu seemed to get away with that, but it puts a lot of pressure on you. And of course, how long the team has faith if you're struggling, right? And you hear all the time from the teams that just pumping up the tires nonstop on the riders, at a certain point that starts to take it out of the whole team, right? That we're told over and over, don't let his confidence possibly get knocked. So, how many of these people can keep their positive attitude through, as you pointed out, a ridiculously grueling time frame? Like even 10 or 11 races in World Superbike 15, 20 years ago, that was a lot of races.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and that's ultimately what separates the really good from the absolute elite? Are you able to have that mentality? And every sport is the same. Like Marshall, you think back to your time playing football. How many times did you get hit in the blind side and you have to just figure out a way to be able to get through that game? Riders have the same challenge, and they need to just find a way to be able to keep that belief in themselves. Teams, at the end of the day, teams lose their belief very quickly. And when you go into a garage and the rider isn't there, you have absolutely no secrets with the team. They know that they're on to a bad time, and that's where it becomes really important to be able to spot the good things that a rider's doing. And sometimes it's something as simple as in FP3 he was eighth fastest, or that was his fastest lap of the weekend. That sector was good, and it's enough to be able to say there's something there. The problem is whenever there's nothing there for a rider and there's nothing there for a team, that's whenever motivation really drops, and that's whenever you're on a hiding to nothing. Because all these riders are talented. Everyone on the grid is super talented, and they're a lot more talented now than they were 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, because the depth in the field is so much stronger. So there was a time where if you were a second off the pace, you were still going to be able to come away with a top 10 finish. You were still going to be able to come away with maybe even a top 5 finish. Whereas now, you're not even going to be in the points. So the perception is he's nowhere, but he could actually be doing a pretty good job, but just not good enough. I think Chanter's a good example of that as well, because he's coming over to World Superbikes this year. And as far as I can tell, obviously he won't be in Phillip Island because of injury, but the expectation is if he knows how to turn the correct way down pit lane, he's exceeded expectations. And you look at it and you're there like, this is a guy that's won Moto2 races. He's had a lot of Grand Prix podiums. He just had a really bad year last year on a satellite Honda team, and it just didn't work for him. But everyone suddenly thinks that he's just terrible. And you're there thinking, no, this is a guy that a few years ago was actually doing a really good job in Moto2, probably the most competitive class in the world.
Alex
But
Marquez.
he lost all of his confidence. Alex Marquez. It takes time for some riders. Marquez was able to get that time. Chanter didn't. Then Chanter's managed to fall onto his feet on a good ride in Superbikes, and hopefully whenever he gets back to full fitness, he's able to show something through the course of the year. But it is one of those situations where he's a good example of just how difficult it is, because, as I said, everyone looks at how he performed last year and instantly he's a terrible rider. Maybe he just wasn't a good MotoGP rider, but he was a good Moto2 rider, and that's hopefully something that will shine through this year for him. Even when you look at Bulaga, a decent Moto3 rider, decent Moto2 rider, great Supersport rider, great Superbike rider. Locatelli was a pretty good Moto3 rider. He wasn't anything on a Moto2 bike, never really stood out. Went to Supersport, went to Superbike. He's done a good job. So everyone has to find that bike that works for them. And a MotoGP bike is just, it's the most technically advanced bike. It's the most difficult bike in the world to ride. So if it takes time, it takes time.
The vibes, I think, is the thing that I came away from on Some Cat Chancher, right? It was just like, as things go, it's like all of a sudden the snowball starts rolling downhill on injuries and mistakes and pace and all the and then he gets beat up as well at the end of last season as being kind of like everybody going at Phillip Island, I believe it was, right? Where, oh man, Bagnaia, man, he's back there with Chantra, and everybody, like across the globe, everyone's going, ew, why is Bagnaia with Chantra? And it's like Chantra was the bottom of the pile and just kept getting punched in the face over and over and over again. So I'm with you. I'm glad to see him land a World Superbike on a good ride and get a chance and opportunity to make the best of it. Last question on World Superbike, out of respect for your time here, and then we'll just ask you a quick one or two about all things MotoAmerica and your experience last year. But I'd love to go down the rabbit hole of the R9 and what you saw from it last year in Supersport, and we're looking forward to seeing that develop kind of more and more in North America as it's gone on. But take away Bulaga, because we have already talked about him and the prospects for this season. Who's the most interesting rider? Not team, not bike, not situation, not just the story going into this World Superbike season, round one, Phillip Island. When you get to the opening media day and everybody is there and you get an opportunity to, whether you're catching up with people in the media center or otherwise, who's the rider that you think is the most interesting story going into this season?
There's no doubt for me, it's Iker Lecuona, because Lecuona is the most intriguing rider on the grid, because for 4 years, I've wondered, is he any good? I've wondered how good he is. I've wondered Why does he crash so much? Why does he get hurt so much? Is that a Honda thing? Is that a Lacuna thing? Now we'll actually find out. And he has to really deliver everything this year, because you sign for the Aruba Ducati team, you've got half a season to be able to perform. They're going to expect from Misano onwards that Bulega is either going to go to MotoGP or else someone has to come in to lead Ducati. If Bulega leaves, Lecuona has to be ready to step up. And he's only ready to step up if he's winning races, if he's the guy that they can trust to be a world champion. Otherwise, you look out for Enea Bastianini or Franco Morbidelli or whoever you want to look at from the MotoGP paddock. So Lecuona, with no real testing during the winter again, has to go to Phillip Island and be ready to perform. Now, when you look at his form in Phillip Island over the years, he's been there 4 times. He's only raced there 1 year, I think, because he had a Super Pole crash last year. He crashed in testing 1 year. He's had other injuries in the past as well. So when you look at all those factors coming into it, I just can't look past Iker as the big storyline of the year. And he could be really good. He could be absolutely fantastic, or it could be really tough, because we saw in the Honda that his ceiling was really high, but his floor was really low. Whereas someone like Xavi Vierge didn't have quite the same level of speed, but his bad days were a lot better. And I think that that's where Lecuona will be interesting to see if was that down to the Honda, and now with a good bike, is he able to perform a lot better? But ultimately, if you're the factory Ducati rider, you're either expected to win races or you're expected to win championships. And Bulega is expected to win the championships. Lecuona needs to show that he can be that team leader, because Ducati's shown it in the past where Bulega replaced Bautista because Alvaro couldn't beat Nicola. And then it meant that Alvaro was cast aside, double world champion for Ducati, and they just threw him away. Chaz Davis won, I don't know what it would have been, 30 odd races for Ducati, a championship contender, always their top rider for many years. Bautista came in and Chaz was gone. So if you're able to perform well, Ducati will make you the man. If you're not able to perform well, you're the forgotten man. And I think that's what's going to make Iker such an interesting story for me to follow this year. I think that's the key one.
Are you telling me that Ducati's willing to just throw aside a 2-time world champion? That doesn't sound like MotoGP at all, right?
I've never heard of this story before.
That's great stuff and great insight, and looking forward to hearing you on the call of all things. But to round things out, I had the pleasant surprise last year when we were at Daytona for the 200. All of a sudden, you hear the iconic and the MotoAmerica broadcast is beginning, and I heard your voice, and I was like, did they put a podcast on by accident? What the hell's going on? Because I had no idea that you were coming over and going to be a part of the MotoAmerica broadcast. You were there all of last year, and I shot you a message in a rush, like, oh, can we chat with you? Didn't get a chance because you were busy as all hell, I'm sure, trying to cover everything that was going on. But what was your experience like last year? What was your takeaway from being a part of all things MotoAmerica in 2025?
I really loved it. I really enjoyed it. I've always watched MotoAmerica. I'm one of those guys that watches as much as I can, because especially for Superbike racing, it's such a small world that there's a few of the domestic championships that you do kind of have to follow. So the British Championship is like that. And for me, MotoAmerica was like that as well, because the depth of rider at the front of the MotoAmerica field is really strong. And there was a few times last year, I remember at one stage I said it, and people in BSB were messaging me saying like that, I don't really agree with this. But for me, the first 5 guys in the MotoAmerica Superbike class are better than the first 5 guys in the BSB Superbike class. But then that 6th to 15th is a lot better in Britain than it is in America. But the sheer talent at the front is great. And I think when you look at the Supersport class last year, it was like that as well. Matthew Scholz has obviously shown a lot in recent years how good he is on a Supersport. We'll see what he can do in a Superbike this year. But PJ Jacobson, PJ could have probably been a race winner at the very least in World Supersport. He was able to contend a few times where maybe with a different team or a bit of luck, he would have been able to challenge for probably a top 3 in the championship. Blake Davis is a young kid that's come in and has done really well. I think that when he was able to win at Laguna last year, he actually made a lot of people in World Superbikes sit up and take a bit of notice of him. And he probably needed to kick on a little bit more than he did in the second half of last year, because if he had done that, I think he would have had a chance to be noticed and maybe down the line Yamaha looking to take someone like him across. But he needs to perform this year as well, so there's pressure on him. You've got Josh Herron moving back to a super sport bike this year, so you've got those comparisons that you're able to make with riders. And I think that's what makes it interesting for Daytona. Right from the start of the season, we get to see that. We get to see DeMario on a super sport bike. I really liked what I saw from him on the Twins Cup bike last year. I thought he looked like a real racer. But what's he going to do on a super sport bike? I don't want to see it where he's a second off the pace, because if he's a second off the pace, he's not good enough. And you need to be able to jump in, even whenever it's so good at the front of the field. You need to be able to jump in and be really competitive from the start, especially whenever you're with a good team. And we know he's going to be with a good team with the Rahal squad. So someone like DeMario is going to be worth keeping an eye on for me. You know, Ty Scott again. We'll see what he can do this year. He was fast last year on the Suzuki. So I think that something like that right from Daytona kind of sets it up nicely. And it's always interesting whenever you can look at the super sport class and be interested about it, because obviously we all want to see superbikes. And the superbike class is great. I'm looking forward to seeing Bobier on a Ducati. That's going to be great. And seeing what happens with Bobby Fong and JD Beach back onto a proper superbike for Beach. That's going to be good to see. And then you wait and see what the likes of, you know, Sean Dillon Kelly and riders like that. And it's because of riders like Bobier and Kelly that you look at it and you say, there is that depth in the field. There is that, or at least at the front of the field. It's really good because those guys are riders that were able to show something on the world stage. Like Cam Bobier was a really fast Moto2 rider on his day. And we saw that a few times. Just didn't quite have the team. I think that that team always just seems to lack something. And on his good days, Bobier was able to overcome that. On his bad days, you're not able to overcome that. And I think that that's where, in the Superbike class, they're lucky that they've got that much depth. Because when you make the comparison to other domestic championships, I don't see that at all. And I think that's where, for me, that was the biggest surprise that I had last year. And then all the other classes, there was always something that was quite interesting to keep an eye on as well. And I thought that was what was quite interesting with it. I don't like the baggers class, but it's actually quite cool when you see it up close. Yeah. And, you know, ultimately they're spending more money on a baggers bike than they are on a super bike. So it should be impressive. But, you know, even whenever you turn up and you see that for the first time, you think, oh, that's pretty impressive. You know, going around Daytona. The hooligans class I quite liked. Stock 1000 was really good. I think it's good that they're moving Stock 1000 and the Superbike class together. I think that's a positive step. Because for one thing as well, I don't think more races means it's better for fans. I've always kind of thought you're better off just having quality races rather than just saying, oh, we're going to have 3 races a weekend in this class, or we're going to put in whether it's the Stock 1000 class or anything like that. You're better off almost having them all racing together, because you know you don't need to have it where the track is in use every second of the day. You want to have it where, you know, there's time for fans to go into the paddock, there's time for fans to go into pit lane and all that kind of thing. Because in a Superbike paddock, we're immediately a lot more accessible than we are if it's a MotoGP paddock, for instance, because, you know, there's no secrets. You're looking at a road bike, so it's not like you're going to be able to reinvent the wheel with it. So it's nice whenever fans are able to take that time to be able to get in. And if you lose one race, you know, maybe you free up 45 minutes for fans to go in and have an autograph session or whatever it is, and be able to try and help grow it a little bit.
Colin, before I throw it to you for one last question to Steve here, I don't know why, but I feel like a bit of a sicko for just wishing this, for hoping, for imagining this. When you mentioned Alessandro Di Mario, the way he carries himself, the way that he was coming up last year and just like dominating, and then the way that he spoke when he was like on the podium, and the way he was, the idea of him and Josh Herrin at some point like clashing on track has the potential to be deeply entertaining. And I'm not wishing for anybody to get, you know, roughed up and all the rest, but it feels like Herrin is probably at some point going to be like, love you, kid, but so I'm interested to see what happens with that this season. But Colin, you got one more for Steve here before we let him go?
Just before you go to Colin, just for that, if DeMario's in a position to be able to challenge Herrin, he shouldn't be in MotoAmerica. He should be in the World Championship. Yeah. Because at his age, with that experience, like that's where ultimately, if you're looking at it very objectively, if he's a second behind Herrin, he's doing a good job. Yep. But is he actually going to be at the level to be able to move to a World Championship? And that's where DeMario needs to be able to decide what he wants to be, because there's too many riders that are happy to be able to live the Instagram life, but don't want to put the hard yards in to be a World Championship rider. Josh Herrin's a perfect example of it, in fairness, because Herrin had all the talent in the world. He went to Moto2 whenever he was young, and it flamed out for him. He's fallen out with so many teams in the past as well that you're able to see certain things that have happened continuously for his career. If DeMario is able to challenge him from the get-go or even by the end of the season, then that's proof of his talent. And if he's able to prove himself to that level, you want to see him really kick on. You look at the best riders that came from AMA or anything like that. Nicky Hayden, Ben Spies, the most recent, American world champions that came across, they were on a superbike when they were 16, 17. They were pushed onto very early in their career. Jonathan Ray, statistically the best superbike rider ever, he was on a superbike whenever he was 17. He was getting pole positions in BSB when he was 17 against deep fields with factory machinery. If you're fast enough and you're ambitious enough, you need to move quickly. Otherwise, you just get stuck for too long. And I think that's one of the big things that for a lot of kids when they're racing, they just want to be able to say, I'm racing in the national championship, I'm winning races. Does it really matter if you're winning races in the Talent Cup or the Twins Cup or the Super Sport class or the Superbike class? Not for your Instagram followers, but it matters for everyone inside the paddock. And that's where I hope that DeMario doesn't get caught up into being happy with just being top 5, top 6, top 7. He needs to really push on if he is that guy. Because maybe he isn't that guy. Maybe he's just a really good Twins Cup rider or a really good Talent Cup rider that had the experience last year to be able to do that. But I kind of hope that he's more than that, because I think we need it as well. We need domestic riders coming through. Garrett Gerloff's the last rider that came over from America, and Garrett's had a solid World Championship career. But it's also where if Garrett were to go back to MotoAmerica, no one's going to cry that he's not on the World Championship grid anymore. Whereas a few years ago, whenever he was really competitive at the front, challenging for podiums and that, people were really expecting him to be that guy for a few years. And I think that's the challenge for a lot of young riders coming through.
Yeah, my question is a conceptual one. World Super Sport, Super Sport, some version of 600 production racing is still a very popular class. And of course, in North America, we stuck with that rather than going to say Moto 2, which is probably what Dorna would have preferred. However, you look at street bike sales, it's not an important category the way it used to be. And certainly in the UK, it was a very important category, whereas a whole range of different platforms of 800 twins are all over the place, which is kind of super hooligan. Is World Super Sport going to be better off, or should it be something that's going to look like like Super Hooligans? Is that where we're headed? And should we get there sooner?
I really hope it doesn't, because I quite like the hooligan class, for instance, but not as the feeder into a superbike class. And I think that anytime that I've heard people talk about moving to naked bikes, or even not so much the bagger style bike, but those adventure style bikes, as that's what we should have in superbike racing, nobody wants to see it either. Manufacturers certainly don't want to see it, because the big thing for them is a superbike makes an awful lot more profit than any other bike that they sell. And I spoke to someone at Honda about this before, and they said that, if you've got all these dirt bikes that you sell, you could sell 1,000 dirt bikes, but you're not making that much money off them. Whereas if you're selling 10 superbikes, you're actually making a lot more money off them, just because of just the profit margin that they have in them. Now, some superbikes are different. Ducati's V4R, that's in all likelihood a loss-making bike, because they've got so much technology on it. It probably costs them a little bit more to build and to ship and all that compared to what they sell it for. And it's only sold at that price because it has to be eligible for racing. That's where whenever you've got the Marquez special edition, it suddenly jumps in the cost, and things like that. So for me, whenever I look at it, I think that the changes that they made to the Super Sport class to go to the next gen rules to allow you to have twins, triples, and 4-cylinder bikes, that was a really positive step. And that's the kind of racing I want to see. I'm not against anything that's making people earn a living, and the baggers is the best example of that. Someone like Kyle Wyman's probably the best paid rider in the MotoAmerica paddock, but I also don't want to see that as being the last race on a Sunday. I want to see it where I still get to see a superbike race, because they're the bikes that I grew up watching. And maybe that'll be different in 10, 15, 20 years, but I don't really see it. It's always one of those things that on the podcast, myself and Gordo have talked about it a lot, and Gordon Ritchie's been in the paddock for 30 years. He's been a journalist since the early 90s. And, one of the things that we've always said is that If manufacturers decided in the morning that they wanted unicycles to be the Superbike World Championship, that's what we'd run. But they've all stuck with the Superbike class and the super sport structure, and even now with the sport bike class replacing 300, that's what they're trying to sell. And if they're trying to sell that, that's what we're going to see racing. If the Superbike World Championship disappeared in the morning, someone else would just start running those bikes in a World Championship as well, because they're the bikes that you can go out and buy. If in Canada and MotoAmerica, they didn't opt for the Moto2 route because, for one thing, it's very expensive. And for another thing, you can just go to a shop and buy these bikes, convert them into a race bike, and you're able to go out on track. And that's the big selling point for all these bikes. Even if it's not where people are actually buying that many of them, they're still buying enough of them. And they're still buying enough Kawasaki's and Yamahas and Hondas to be able to justify developing a superbike as well. So, for someone like Ducati, they'll always have a superbike. For Bimota coming back into superbike racing now, and probably going into MotoAmerica as well in 2027, when you look at those kind of manufacturers, they need to have a racing heritage. Someone like Honda, they've always had a racing heritage. Yamaha wants to have that heritage as well, and the same for some of the other manufacturers. So I don't see it where we really change away from the model that we have going forward. I think all that we're going to see is Michelin will come in, lap times will get slower, and we'll still race the same bikes that we have, because just by not having Pirelli qualifying tires, we'll be slower in World Superbikes and in domestic championships as well. That'll all filter down into it, you'd imagine. But it'll mean that if you're slower than that, you don't have to change. The only reason that you're going to really change those classes is if the FIM suddenly say, we don't want a superbike to be faster than a MotoGP bike, which, in all like no one inside the sport has ever considered a superbike to be faster than a MotoGP bike. You see like maybe one lap in a qualifying tire, but it's 40 seconds a race slower, so it's a lot slower. So I think that until something like that changes, I don't really see why there'd be a desire as much as anything else to really change the full structure.
Yeah, definitely. It's a good thing too, Colin, because if they ended up, having people going out there in adventure sport and sport touring and all the rest, you'd be dragging the knee on the GS, and you'd be at a retirement, and all of a sudden all hell's gonna break loose. Which, by the way, do you want to tell Steve just like your connection to Gordo, or before we get out of here, because I know you're tempted, you want to pull the trigger.
Go ahead.
Oh, just that we used to be quite friendly, and of course, we're both Scottish, so it's we're equally hard done by in the world, because that's how Scottish people are, right?
I have joked before, Steve, on this podcast with Colin, saying that my favorite part of the World Superbike shows is listening to Gordo say the word Bimota. It's nothing gets me more excited for World Superbike than hearing Gordo say the word Bimota.
All that I want to see is Bimota go out and hire Joe Shimoda. And he moves across, and Gordo has to say Joe Shimoda on a Bimota, and that'll just make it for me. But it is funny, Colin, because Gordo is easily the most popular person in the World Superbike paddock. He's been there forever, and he loves it, and everyone gravitates towards Gordo.
That's great stuff.
Well, I just got my new moto course today, and I was reading up on things, so it's I'm not going to get any work done for a few days.
That's awesome.
The Bible is the most important thing that you get each year, and I always have it where I look back over the last few years for going to Phillip Island now this weekend. I'll look back to all of the last year's rounds, but then you pay special attention then to Phillip Island 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And auto courses or moto course is great for that, just to be able to remind you everything that's happened.
Well, when Richie was filling in his collection, and I'm only slightly embarrassed to say I've had the collection since the start. I bought them all when they were new. But when he was filling in the ones he missed, some of the ones he has are from a photographer who sold pictures to Motocourse. So it's got his notes in it, which I think makes it pretty interesting. And like when you go to Silverstone and you're walking down the hall, some of those images are also in Motocourse, right? From the 70s, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I've seen the books, and Gordo has tried to sell me the books that aren't the ones that have all the notes in them. But when you see things like that, it's always what makes Motocourse special, and it's where having your full library of it is really valuable. Not in terms of what you could sell it for, but just what it means for everyone. Like when you're a fan, things like that matter. and just being able to open it up and look back at their top 10 list or this, that, the other. Like I do the same on a regular basis. And I think that the house is about to fall down on the weight of all the different books I have.
That's great stuff. Steve, we will let you go. Thank you so much for the time. We wish you safe travels to get out there to Phillip Island and being so generous with your time before you set sail and go for the one big flight of the year. I know it's real stressful.
And go see the fairy penguins. Yeah. Make sure you do that.
I have seen them, Colin. So I'll be on the beach in Phillip Island. Maybe not at sunset to be able to see the penguins again, but it is one of those things.
It is a little
that when
disturbing
you go,
watching the seals eating them, right? That isn't the warmest memory.
That's okay. We're excited for the first round of the World Superbike Championship, and Bridgestone CSBK around the corner. Daytona coming up in less than a month as it stands right now as we record this, and all of it getting things going here in 2026. Steve, thank you for everything, and we're looking forward to hopefully catching up with you at some point in the middle of the World Superbike season to see just how wrong Colin and I were about all of our thoughts on the paddock going into this year. Thanks, man.
No problem.
Thank you.